Well, hello everybody. Welcome to a little presentation on dwarfism and dwarfism awareness. It is October, and that means it is Dwarfism Awareness Month in the United States. Now you might be saying to yourself, why is my physics teacher going to be talking about little people, dwarfism? Well, this is why. Over here is my family. My wife's taking the picture, so she's not in the picture. This is maybe a year ago, I think, at Thanksgiving. So you can see me, right? That's my now 25-year-old son. I think he's about 24 in that picture. This is my youngest, who is now 13, now in this picture about 12. And then this is our middle daughter, who is 21, so about 20 in this picture. And I think you can see from this picture that she is quite a bit shorter than my son and I, or even her 12-year-old sister at the time. Right? So she was 20 here, sister's 12. This is actually at a conference, which I'll talk more about, in Denver. But this was, we took a picture of her. This is her right here. So there's my daughter. This is her friend Kelly. Right? I forget what this guy's name is. Another friend of hers that she sees at conferences. They're all little people. This is my daughter's best friend in high school, Savannah, who is average sized. And then these two tall gentlemen back here, one's a cousin and one's a friend of this guy here, right? So we kind of put him in this picture. Kelly, whenever we do pictures like this, always likes to scowl because she ends up being the shortest of all of them. So, in other words, I have a little person as a daughter. And so that gave me, of course, an interest in dwarfism and being a science teacher and all. And learned some about it, and I like to take an opportunity for a little teachable moment here to teach you a bit about dwarfism. And of course, we'll talk a lot about the science of it as well, and some awareness issues with it. So first of all, we belong and have belonged since my daughter was about 6 months old to a group called Little People of America, LPA. You might have seen some posters or things around my room about this. LPA is a group that provides social support and other things, and medical support for little people. They define dwarfism as a medical or genetic condition where you end up being 4'10" or shorter. So there's about 30,000 people in the U.S. That are dwarfs, right? About 651,000 people in the entire world. Those are, of course, estimates. In some parts of the world, it's hard to tell exactly how many there are, as in some parts of the world, they're not treated very well, discriminated against. But 30,000 people here in the U.S., we have a population of about 330 million people. So 30,000 might seem like a lot, but you can go a long time without seeing another little person. So not really a very prevalent thing. The Little People of America group, LPA, we have over 8,000 members, lots of chapters in all 50 states. There are organizations in other countries. We've did a conference once with Canada in Toronto. England has a large group, Australia. Lots of countries are starting to have these kinds of groups. We have the chapter we belong to is called the Motor City chapter, so it's centered in and around Detroit, which we were lucky enough to just live here with my daughter because it's a very active chapter. Large membership and very active locally and nationally. A lot of the leaders of LPA and things have come from our chapter. And so it was a good chapter to be part of. Taught us a lot about raising a little person. So I mentioned national conferences. This is something we go to almost every year. And they're held in different cities around the country. Even had one in Toronto in 2001. We've been everywhere from on the West Coast, Seattle and LA, San Francisco. On the East Coast, we've done Boston, New York City, a couple times in Florida. It was in Detroit in 2008 that we hosted at the RenCen in downtown Detroit. And so it just kind of bounces around to different places. We have anywhere from about 1,500 to 2,500 people there, which are little people, and in the cases of younger little people, their parents perhaps, and others, friends, right, associated people. So we basically go into some big, usually downtown hotel, and take the hotel over for a full week. It's a long conference. Lots of activities. They always say that, when the little people are young, it's mostly for the parents, right? So when my daughter was young, we went there and went to a lot of medical workshops and met with doctors, and they come to the conference specifically for this. Geneticists from around the country and sometimes around the world come and do free clinics for people, but they also do seminars to teach us all about it. And so we did a lot of those early on. Eventually, my wife was the national parent coordinator for a few years, where she would get calls from around the country for new parents of little people to point them in the right direction and get them resources. And she did workshops at these conventions. But there's a lot of social things going on at these. There's dances every night. There's a lot of networking stuff, and there's sports. The DAAA, the Dwarf Athletic Association of America, which was started, by the way, by people in this area, right around us, is now an organization that does national games every year. They play all sorts of sports. Soccer is a huge one. Basketball, swimming events, weightlifting, bocce ball, pretty much any kind of sport. Track and field is huge. And, they do it for all different age groups. At the older ages, it can be a way to get into the Paralympics. Sometimes Paralympians are little people. At the younger age group, it's just for them to be able to compete against people that are their own size. My daughter has done volleyball, soccer for a few years, track and field when she was young, those kinds of things. So sports are huge at these conferences, especially for the young ones. So there are over 400 different types of dwarfism, and that number grows all the time, right? As we learn more about the genetics, the bigger categories tend to get broken up into more specific categories. So when my daughter was young, it was closer to, I think, maybe 100 different types that were known at the time, right? And so now they break it up into 400 different types, but that's growing. Although we still know people that are undefined, right? They have a type that is just their own. They have no group, and at this point, they might not even have a genetic background yet for them. There are some more common types than others that I want to talk about, and talk about some of the properties of those types. This is the most common type. It's called achondroplasia. ACONs, as we call them for short. Spondyloepiphyseal dysplasia. Say that 5 times fast. That's actually my daughter's type. SED for short, all right? So they're called SEDs. Sometimes they throw a little C on there for congenita, in which case it's spondyloepiphyseal dysplasia congenita. That's the second or maybe third most common type. It kind of depends who you talk to. I'm going to talk about that one as well, since it's obviously very important to me, being the type of dwarfism that my daughter has. Dystrophic dysplasia. I believe this is what, if you've ever watched the show Little People, Big World, the father on that show, Matt Roloff, has dystrophic dysplasia. Pseudoachondroplasia, osteogenesis imperfecta, which is OI for short. This is also known as brittle bone syndrome. So you might have heard of that. Right? It's a little more common, but you might have heard of OI. Well, I shouldn't say common in terms of numbers, but might have heard of that kind of thing. So these are, 5 types, but there's over 400 different types. You start to get a little bit good at kind of diagnosing visually, but, sometimes it's hard to put people in a particular category. And again, we know people that don't really even have a type. They're just undefined types of dwarfism. So at this point, I want to talk a little bit about terminology and some of the things that you might have already heard me say and wondered about. Right? And also as a kind of an educational thing in case you do come into contact with someone with dwarfism. So there are some commonly accepted terms. Short-statured. All right? I believe in England it's actually called the Society for the Short-Statured. Little person, dwarf. All right? I know that when my daughter was first diagnosed, my wife and I thought that dwarf wouldn't be an accepted term, but it's actually the medical term. Right? They have a form of dwarfism, and so dwarf is actually a very accepted term. It just sounds weird, I think. The word is a little weird, and for somebody like me that read a lot of Lord of the Rings and things growing up, I had a definite idea of what I thought of as a dwarf. right? Which is not what my daughter is in that sense. She's not a Lord of the Ring little person. Not that they used any actual little people when they made the Lord of the Rings. Don't get the little person community started on that. They were not happy. Instead, they used camera tricks to make them look small. But anyway, dwarf is an accepted term. Little person is part of the name of the organization, Little People of America. It's an older term, and it's kind of one of those that's a bit in flux. It's probably not as completely accepted now as it once was. Perhaps the younger crowd would be less likely to use little person. They find it, sometimes they think it might be a little bit demeaning. I guess it's the little aspect of it. But dwarf is definitely big, short-statured. And so you might have noticed that I said this a few times, like when talking about one of the first pictures there. We say average height, right, instead of normal height, right? Because what's normal, right? They might be different, but they're not abnormal, right? So you have average height. And every disability group kind of has this kind of terminology, and sometimes, you're not aware of it, but as you become aware of it, it's good to use, right? It's good, acceptable terms. It's proper, right? And it's polite, right, to use these kinds of terms. So I would say that, my other two children are average height, right? And my daughter is short-statured, or she has a form of dwarfism. Now, this last word, okay, the M word, as they would say in the group, this is an older term, okay, and you got to realize kind of where it came from. Okay, in the 1800s, they would take a lot of times, especially disproportionate dwarfs, and, they'd be in freak shows and circus sideshows and things like that. I mean, there were times when they were actually in Coney Island in New York City. There was a time when they had a little village where they built this little town, right? And you could walk around like above it on like catwalks and look down, and they actually had little people that lived there that you could look at, kind of like you look at an animal in a zoo, see them in their natural habitat or something like that, right? I mean, so that was the kind of thing that used to happen, and certainly in that freak show kind of era. And so the term midget was often used then for those people, and not in a nice way. Right? And so that word is definitely a fighting word for a lot of little people. You want to get my daughter riled up a bit, you use that term. Sometimes it's used, unknowingly, in which case it becomes a little teachable moment for me or my wife. Sometimes for my daughter, depending on how she feels at that point, whether she'll explain to you why that's not proper or whether she'll just tell you to go away. But it's not a word used in polite conversation. So again, short-statured, little person, dwarf, or if you were to ask my daughter, hey, what do you want to be called? She would say Chapin, because that's her name, right? So just like everybody else, they have their own name, and that's probably what you ought to use. But again, proper terminology, not so much. Although, it's kind of like some of the other words that are negative, that have that negative connotation. The younger ages are kind of trying to reclaim it somewhat, right? You'll see it they'll have it on T-shirts or things like that. But it's kind of like a lot of the things, if they want to use it, they can use it, but I would never use it, right? Not my place. So, just something to keep in mind. So I want to talk about the couple of most common types. Acons are, generally speaking, the most common type. Like 50% of all dwarfism is achondroplasia. So it's a pretty common type of a very uncommon thing. Okay? One of the interesting things, and this is true of dwarfism in general, about 80% of little people have parents who are average height. So they don't have the dwarfism gene. They don't have the achondroplasia gene, which is a dominant gene. We'll talk a little bit more. It's de novo, as they say in science. Okay, so it's a spontaneous mutation of a gene. So my daughter's is also a dominant type. So neither my wife or I are little people, and So when my daughter was born, it was some sort of spontaneous mutation that occurred. Just one of those things, right? And that happens in about 80% of the cases. Right? So you have average-sized parents with little people kids. In the case of achondroplasia, they actually know the gene, and it is one single gene that they know of, right? And they know where it is on that gene, and it's the one that causes achondroplasia. And there's a lot of work going on with possible gene therapies, things like that. Right now, there's no real treatment. And that, even saying that, you can kind of hear me stumble a little bit because it's kind of a tricky thing to talk about within the community. This is true of a lot of communities like that, like the deaf community or the blind community. They don't always like cochlear implants and things like that because, you're changing people. Certainly there are ways to treat the effects of dwarfism, or maybe some of the issues that little people have, right? But now there's a lot of work going on with, of course, genetics, right, to see if there are drugs or other kinds of things that maybe could change it more for younger people. But we shall see over time. It's a little medical slide I found somewhere. So this is, of course, a younger achon and an older achon. Some of the things you'll notice about achons. First off, most achons are around 4 feet tall, give or take an inch or two. The women might be 3'11", 4 feet. The men are 4'1", 4'2"-ish. There are different types of dwarfism that are related to achondroplasia, different genes that might be a little taller, a little shorter. Okay, but true achons are usually right around 4 feet. And as you can see in the picture here, they end up being, one of the doctors said this at a meeting I was at. He said they're built like little tanks. He was talking to a parent who was asking, can my achon kid do this? Should I let them do this? And he was like, they are built like little tanks. Just let them go. That's because they have small arms and legs, right? So the muscles are more bunched up, and so it makes them look ripped. One of the first things when we joined Little People of America that my family went to was we went to a pool party in the summer, and it was a little get-together at somebody's house. It was a family that used to live in Northville, and it was a family of little people. There were the two parents, and they had, what did they end up with? I think like 4 kids, and they were all little people, and the house was all made down to their scale, which was kind of interesting, right? So, the toilet was like a foot off the floor and that kind of thing, right? The shower was lower, the sinks were lower, everything like that, for their house was built, for them. But it was a pool party, and my wife and I were watching all these teenage boys, and eventually we called one over and we asked him, we said, do you guys work out a lot? And they kind of laughed because they're like, no, this is just the way we all look. We all look like this as teenagers. We look like we work out all the time, but we really don't. They're just built like little tanks, basically. Common things besides the short arms and legs, they often have larger heads. They call this mid-face hypoplasia thing, means that if you feel the bridge of your nose between your eyes, right, theirs is recessed, so there's not it doesn't come out, so it's kind of flat between their eyes. It gives them kind of a common nose appearance, generally speaking, right? They have a common look. They also sometimes have leg bowing, which can be fixed with an operation if it gets to be too bad and gets in the way of them walking around. Trident hand is also one of the ones you look at, like with babies and things. And that doesn't mean that their hand stays stuck like that. See, with the opening between the fingers there, right? It's just that it's just the way it rests. They can move their fingers, like anybody can, but it just is kind of at rest instead of the 4 fingers being together. Right, the first 2 and the last 2 kind of separate a bit, so it looks like a trident. Right? Fingers are generally shorter and stubbier, as opposed to my daughter's type, where they have more average-sized hands. The little people woman, when we first started bringing my daughter around, would always ooh and ah over her hands, and they'd say she could wear average-sized jewelry. Wouldn't have a problem wearing rings and things because her fingers were so long. But those are some of the things you'll notice if you ever see an achon. My daughter's type, spondyloepiphyseal dysplasia. If you take the words apart, spondylo is spine, right? So hers are issues with spine, and the epiphyses, which are the ends of the long bones. So that's the epiphyseal, okay, the ends of the long bones. Dysplasia means they're messed up, right? So my daughter's is more of a short spine dwarfism. If you sit next to an acon, they have what you would call average sitting height. So if you were to sit in chairs next to an acon, their head would probably be about the same height as yours, right? But their feet would dangle off the ground because they have shorter legs and arms, right? Well, my daughter's type is kind of the opposite. She has a very short spine, short neck. Some SEDs kind of look like their head is right on top of their neck, right on top of their shoulders without a neck in between. They have one, it's just small, right? But they tend to have problems with the ends of the long bones. My daughter, for example, has very bad hips. She's probably a year or two away from needing to get some hip replacements because the ball and socket joint for hers is not very well formed. There's a lot of rubbing that goes on. Her type is a problem with type 2 collagen. And so that affects things like their eyes and the cartilage in their joints and those kinds of things. So SEDs are a little different. It's a big category, so it's being constantly broken down into more and more specific types. And because of that, SEDs kind of have a range. We know some SEDs that are about 3 feet tall as adults. Okay, my daughter's about 4'2". We know some SEDs that push the definition of what it is to be a little person. So they're like, 4'9", 4'10". So it's a very large range of heights in SED, mainly because there's different types. There's many different genes or several different genes that are involved, and which ones and how they're expressed in any different person kind of affects what kind of things they have, what kind of their height, different things like that, right? But like I said, it's a short trunk thing, right, as opposed to a short arm and leg thing. Right? So it does tend to make them look like they have long arms and legs, right? They do, but only when you look at them in proportion to their spine. Right? My daughter happens to be barrel-chested, which means her sternum sticks out, which is actually a good thing, because when you have a short trunk, right, that means there's not a lot of room to put all of the organs and things. So being barrel-chested, your chest is bigger, means you have more room to fit things. So it's actually a good thing that she is barrel-chested with her SED. And like I said, it's changes in type 2 collagen. It's got a lot of issues with connective tissues, bone growth, like I said, the development of the eye. My daughter is very nearsighted, has been nearsighted. She's had glasses since she was 1, which, yes, you can figure out with kids that can't talk yet, basically if they need glasses. Although I guess by that time she was probably wearing glasses or talking. But she wore them the moment you put them on. We didn't realize that she was that nearsighted, but she was very nearsighted even as an infant. She used to do things like stand right in front of the television set. And we used to yell at her to get out of the way. But we didn't realize then that she was doing that because she couldn't see it if she sat back with us. So, once we had her diagnosed when she was about, what was she, about a year and a half old, was when we actually got the final diagnosis. We initially got one that was wrong. They said she was an acon because it's the most common type, so that's what they tend to diagnose if they don't know any better. And then we went to U of M Ann Arbor, and they said, no, not an acon, but they still didn't have the right type. The little people were telling us she was SED, but, eventually we went to a conference in Minneapolis and went to the children's hospital there, and the doctors that come to the conference looked at her x-rays and diagnosed her. And, then we started learning all about her. So let's talk a little bit about genetics here, right? It's a science class after all. It's some Punnett squares. There are about 1 out of every 10,000 births. Okay, 1 out of every 10,000, which might seem like a lot, but again, as we said, only about 30,000 or so in the U.S. out of 330 million people, so it's a pretty rare thing. My daughter's type, it's a little hard to exactly know, but they say that my daughter's type is probably maybe 1 out of every 40,000 births. all right, is my daughter's type. And again, most common, that it's a spontaneous mutation of a gene. So it's very rare to have more than one in a family, right? Because it's a spontaneous thing. But I was at a conference once and in a meeting for people with SED and their parents. And when the doctor explained that, this young woman, probably in her early 20s, raised her hand and said, "Oh, well, have SED, and this is my sister, and she also has SED, and those are my parents, and they're both average sized." And the doctors both got very excited and said, "You have to come see us afterwards." Because it's a very rare thing that you end up with more than one in the same family if your parents are average sized. There is a specialized case, which has a very technical name, but in which that can occur, in which it's more likely to have multiple children. When my youngest was born, my wife's doctors were very concerned, and we kept telling them, "Don't worry about it," right? We had about the same chance of having a little person with my third child as anybody does, right? Because it's a spontaneous mutation. It's just one of those things, right? So the doctors were concerned. We weren't really very concerned. Obviously, we weren't scared of it anymore. And so it didn't really matter to us one way or the other, but the doctors were concerned about it. And we were like, no problem. It's probably not going to happen. But it's rare enough that it's hard to find physicians that actually know a lot about it. For the longest time, my daughter's main doctor was a geneticist who worked out of University of Wisconsin-Madison. And he would come into Michigan a couple of times a year and do clinics out in Grand Rapids, and we would drive out there for her to see him, or we would see him at conferences so that he could evaluate how she was doing. Her local doctor basically just took a crash course in dwarfism, right, so that she could learn all about her and, how to help her if need be. My daughter's been, by the way, very healthy. Hasn't had an operation yet. Probably could use some hip operations soon, but, other than that. Like I said earlier, it's usually a de novo type of thing, right? So spontaneous mutations of one, or my daughter's case, perhaps several genes. So a lot of types, and probably most dwarves, have dominant dwarfism genes, okay? Which means you only need one, you have a pair of genes, right? So only one of them has the dwarfism gene, and the other one has the non-dwarfism gene, okay? That's if you have a dominant type. These are ones like acons, pseudoacons, hypoacons, SEDs, like my daughter, right? So a couple of the more common types are dominant disorders. So let's talk about the Punnett squares here. Let's talk about a couple of situations. Let's say you have a little person, and then they're going to have a child with an average-sized person. Okay, so here is the little person. The capital D is the dwarfism gene, right? It's the dominant gene. Okay, so they have one of those, and then they have one average-sized gene. The average-sized person has both average-sized genes. Okay, so if you work through the Punnett square here, you can see that they basically have a 50-50 shot. 50% of the time, they would have a little person, 50% of the time, average-sized. And we certainly know couples that have had, some of both. Right? We know little person families that have average-sized children, and some that have dwarf children, and some that have some of both. Right? But in this case, right, it's kind of a 50-50 thing. Now, if they're both acons, let's say, or both SEDs, right, so each one has a single dominant gene, then this is the Punnett square. So you'll notice here you've got a 50% chance of being a little person. You have a 25% chance only of having average sized. And then this one up here, so 50%, right, dwarf, 25% average. This one up here is the sad one, all right? It's called homozygous, and it's not compatible with life. If they end up going to term, they generally don't live very long. It's kind of like they get dwarfism on steroids. It's like they get all the dwarfism things, but in major ways. and it's not compatible. So it's a 25% chance. It's actually about one of the only things that type of genetic testing that the little people community is definitely in favor of. They have a lot of issues with genetic testing and things like that, just from whether or not people will want to have those children. But if it's in the case of, say, like this, right, they might do a genetic test to see whether or not there's a double dominant kind of thing happening. When my third child was born, the doctors wanted to do a genetic test, and we turned them down. We said, doesn't matter to us, and likely not going to be a little person anyway, so, why do some sort of invasive test? But this is the one case where they're actually in favor of it. It's kind of a sad thing. Doesn't happen a lot, but it happens. And then, of course, you get into the areas where, what if they're mixed types? And then it's, who knows what's going to happen in terms of that. Or, you might have, again, I referenced earlier, Little People, Big World, right? In that case, the father is diastrophic, and the mother, who's actually from Michigan, she is an achon. She has achondroplasia. And so they have no children that were diastrophic. They had 3 average-sized children and 1 who has achondroplasia. And he has, I believe, 1 or 2 little person children with an average-sized wife. So it's all genetics. It's all percentages. On the other hand, there are a few less types that are recessive disorders. Okay, in which case you have to have it in both genes. Okay, so either your parents are little, or they have to be a carrier, which means they have it in one gene, right? But because they only have it in one gene, they themselves are average sized, right? But then they happen to pass on those genes to their child. Right? So as you can imagine, this is a little more rare. Okay. Diastrophic dysplasia, cartilage hair hypoplasia, all right, are 2 types that are recessive. So this was the case, for example, the father in Little People, Big World, both of his parents were average sized. So in this case, got to be careful here. This is the average sized gene, right? This is the recessive, say, diastrophic dysplasia gene. Okay, so this is the recessive gene. So if we do the Punnett square here, right, you can see that in 50% of the time, right, they have a child that is average sized but a carrier. 25%, they have an average sized child that doesn't have the gene at all. And then only 25% of the time, they have a child that has both recessive genes and therefore will have that type of dwarfism. Okay, so this is different than the double dominance, right? This double recessive just means they're a little person. Okay, but notice how, what has to happen here, right? You've got to have, so in his case, his parents had no idea that they were both happened to be carriers, right? And then you kind of hit the genetic jackpot here, this 1 out of 4 chance that they passed along the recessive gene, both of them did. The interesting thing, though, is that he has a brother who didn't want to be in the show, so you've never seen him, who is also the same type of little person, right? So it happened to them twice, which is kind of interesting, right? It's not very, it's very low chance, but, things happen. If you actually had 2, I'm sorry, this is 1 non-carrier parent and 1 parent that is a little, right? Now you see that you end up with no little person children, right? But they're all carriers. Okay? So non-affected carriers. And then if they're both recessive gene dwarfism type, like diastrophic, okay, then basically you get 100% diastrophic, right? Because they're each going to pass along a recessive gene. So lots of genetics with little people. It's also very interesting when you're a physics teacher and your child is diagnosed with a form of dwarfism, right? I very quickly got into these little Punnett squares I hadn't done since high school when I took biology in high school, and quickly learned about all of them because it's one of the things you always want to think about. When my child gets older, are they going to have kids, and will their kids be little people? Will they be average sized? What's that going to be like? Can they have kids? My My daughter's been told that she's big enough and has the build enough that if she chose to, she could probably have a child. Sometimes with SEDs, they might be too small to carry a child to term or have other issues with it. But my daughter's case, if she decides to have one, she could have one. 100% diastrophic. So that's a whole lot of science, a little bit of awareness, right, about little people. If you have some questions, feel free to, ask me about it. I'd be happy to tell you stories about these things or find information for you or anything like that. It's a good teachable moment. You don't meet a lot of little people. And maybe if you do someday, you go to college and you meet a little person, or you end up working with a little person, you'll know a little bit about them. Have a little awareness about them, and you'll treat them well, hopefully. So I hope you enjoyed this little, very scientific discussion of dwarfism and a little bit of dwarfism awareness. And happy National Dwarfism Awareness Month.